professionals who were not necessarily the writer, but it made a lot of sense because Barry Goldwater was the first guy in the era that this book tells who actually brought very, if not totally, libertarian ideas into actual electoral politics in a significant way. And as everyone, both libertarians and those who want to make fun of libertarians will remind us, and he got trounced mightily, and he did worse than, any major candidate had ever done. But, the ideas have gone farther. Didn't end with Barry Goldwater, didn't end with any of these people. Been a lot of victories for the movement. I think this story, for people who do care about these ideas, is inspirational. Obviously, we do not yet live in a libertarian world. I do think we live in a world where fights on libertarian grounds are more front and centered in American government than we could have ever imagined. Might get into that more later. And so, to me, this is a story of rank outsiders, despised, abused, hated, really super isolated people who fought for ideas that were noble, that ultimately were about minimizing the use of violent force in human affairs. And that's, I kind of came into libertarianism through a little bit of a hippy-dippy path. I was a Robert Anton Wilson libertarian, if any of you know what that means. So freedom is great. Of course, we all believe in freedom. As Ayn Rand noted in her puckishly, if not trollishly titled book, The Virtue of Selfishness, a lot of people look at obsession with your own liberty as selfish. And she tried to explain why, yeah, it is, and also that's great. But you can also frame the Libertarian Project as not about liberty per se, but about the flip side of liberty, which is we are minimizing the areas in which anyone else is justified in using violent force against you. In those areas where no one is justified in using it, that is the area of your liberty. And I found that has been a rhetorically effective way to explain what are you guys all about? What is it you want? Well, we want human social relations to be based the least possible they can be on violence. And some of us think that means eliminating it perhaps entirely, except for in self-defense. Some think we need a little more. I will stop ranting now and let Gene begin a conversation.
Yeah, you pick up the story with the, in the post-war era, and you said the original proto-libertarian movement was isolated, and you really get a sense that it started small. Through the end of the 50s, you say it was really more like a gang than a movement, and you read the correspondence of the early figures, and they get excited because a bright high school student, discovered libertarianism. But another thing the book did, I guess I knew this already, but it's easy to forget. It reminded me that for such an odd, difficult, and periodically dysfunctional group of people, that the achievements of the modern libertarian movement have been pretty impressive. Not just the intellectual achievements, the socialist calculation debate, the Nobel Prizes won by various libertarians, but in concrete policy terms. This little gang didn't smash the state, but there are some ways in which they won policy victories that made the world freer than it was before. Can you talk about some of those?
Sure. I think most of them can be connected to the one of my five central figures who was undoubtedly the most directly and specifically influential so far, which is Milton Friedman. And you look at his advocacy of a monetarist approach to a Federal Reserve policy. It has never fully ruled Federal Reserve policy, but the understanding he imbued about how you cannot willy-nilly and constantly, raise the money supply from kind of the mid-'70s on had helped create an era of Fed management that was less damaging than I think it would otherwise have been without Milton Friedman existing. The fact that we currently lack a military draft, he was one of the great intellectual linchpins of that. The fact that we now live in a world of floating international exchange rates, very Friedmanish. We have not yet won this victory in terms of how the government manages its existing welfare state, but Friedman was a great arguer for a government redistribution that left as much decision-making power in the hands of the recipients as possible. He advocated ultimately, we don't have it yet, something that he called a negative income tax, which is, look, don't have government running all these programs, running all these bureaucracies, trying to manage how people behave. Like if we are going to attempt to keep people above a certain level of destitution, just give them money. And I think that as long as the welfare state exists, that probably is the best approach. And that's continued to be a live idea in the debate because of him. All of the deregulations we've seen from the 70s and on, a lot of them derived from the Chicago school economists who were not necessarily libertarians across the board or libertarian activists, though Friedman, one of their leaders, was. You know, anything that's happened in the last 40 years where people have more choices about how to run their businesses, you know, how to manage their lives, you know, the spread of medical marijuana and then legalized marijuana. These are all victories for libertarian ideas. It's not always the case that you can definitely identify that the bureaucrat got the idea from this libertarian thinker, but the intellectual atmosphere that was shaped by Mises, Hayek's, Friedman's, and Rand's has made America a much better and freer place than it would otherwise have been, though not yet, obviously, as free as a libertarian would like.
So some of those victories are, you know, they sound like, and, you know, conservatives sometimes take credit for them, you know, stable monetary policy, deregulation, maybe not the draft, and drug decriminalization. Another one would be school choice, and this is another thing that Milton Friedman, you know, played a key role in. Wall Street Journal had a piece recently that said in the last 5 years, the number of states with universal voucher programs went from 0 to 10. And that's an idea that comes right out of capitalism and freedom. Maybe it was, you know, it took red state governors and conservative activists to bring it about, but it's, you know, something he was talking about in 1961. And yet, despite, you know, some of those occasional alliances with conservatives, as you detail in the book, historically libertarians have had a pretty fraught relationship with the right. Let's talk a little bit about that. Fusionism, the original Frank Meyer idea, and how you know, prominent conservatives and libertarians reacted to, you know, this bid for unity between traditionalists and libertarians.
Yeah, you know, you can kind of look at the conservative side for Russell Kirk as kind of the you know, the epitome of that traditionalist version of conservatism that has been the most hostile toward libertarianism. Kirk very much believed that there was a certain sense of transcendent order that was necessary for human culture to be healthy, wealthy, and virtuous, and libertarians may often actually agree that that's true, but don't see it as having a lot of policy relevance in a way that Kirk might have. And Murray Rothbard, on the other side, though, through strange little bits of culture that have happened until he died, there's many ways in which Rothbard is kind of much more of a right-wing figure in the libertarian thing, and it's maybe too complicated to get into now. But certainly in the 60s and 70s, and most of the time when he was alive, he was explicitly more of a left-wing figure and explicitly saw himself as against the Kirkite, Buckleyite right. One of his main issues about that, and he did kind of poke at the clerical traditionalist aspect of it, but also the foreign policy aspect of it, that conservatives tended to believe that the cause of fighting the Cold War, fighting the influence of international communism, was sufficient excuse for all sorts of both domestic and international government action that a Rothbard or most libertarians did not agree with. And even within the libertarian world, Rothbard was kind of a left outlier. He was certainly the most radical in terms of what he thought it was acceptable for the U.S. government to do overseas to fight communism. There were certain people, including, say, Robert Poole, the guy who ran Reason Magazine, where I worked for a long time. He was more of a Cold War libertarian. You know, there's some libertarians who think that, you know, the cause of liberty is not, you know, not won unless it's won globally, and the kind of Rothbard line more looks at the notion that, you know, you can just spend all of America's liberty and treasure in a futile attempt to try to make the world free, and it's just not going to work, and it's going to destroy liberty here in the attempt. So, the traditionalism and the Cold War were two of the sticking points. But where they met is in a lot of the areas where we discussed some of the victories. Like most of the libertarian victories, most of them, with the exception of the medical marijuana stuff, and even there, I think the whole notion, the right has sort of dissolved the notion that it has to be against, that sort of recreational drug use, I think, to a large degree. It's the areas where they overlap, which is the free market economics. Libertarian triumphalists like myself might like to emphasize, and I think there's a bit about that in the book, that everything that conservatives actually succeeded with and everything that was a conservative idea was really a libertarian idea. Like all conservatives actually had going for them was the kind of free market stuff that they got from Friedman, that they got from Mises, that they got from Hayek. So I especially in the context of now, maybe am less liable to emphasize the distinctions. They're still important to this day. To the extent that you look at the Trump administration, if that's a representative of the American right, you have these massive areas mostly involving the free flow of, capital goods and people across national borders, where Trump has positions that are very unlibertarian in traditional sense. But then again, you look at things like the attempts to cut government jobs, in a manner that it's pretty Rothbardian, more Rothbardian than anything else, in the sense that it's kind of wild and it's rooted in just like we do not like the state. We hate the state. That's like a Rothbardian phrase. And we're just out to damage it and chip away at it. And yeah, you may have your little Hayekian rule of law concerns about, are we doing this with the proper separation of powers and who actually gets to decide where to spend the money, and we have rules about this, and that's a Hayekian libertarian take that might be a little concerned about how that's all going. But the Rothbardian side, I think, clearly would be like, yes, 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 grind these, I'm not going to curse, a light curse word that Rothbard might use to refer to government employees. Because he had a kind of class warfare view of it, not in the Marxian sense, but just in the sense that there's a governing class, and there's all the people who live off the government, whether it be government employees or recipients of government benefits, and they're the enemies of the rest of us who are not that class. And in the service of that class warfare, he'd be less worried about these kind of Hayekian rule of law concerns. But both are part of the libertarian movement, and if you're trying to sort of parse out libertarianism and the right, libertarianism versus the right, those are both different ways to look at it and prove either the rich variety of libertarian thought or its essential incoherence, as enemies might say, but I lean on the side of rich variety.
So you touched on this a second ago, but Rothbard's New Left period, where he made he's sort of the most strategically promiscuous of the major libertarian figures. Yeah. And starting in the mid-'60s, he makes a bid for an opening to the left. He briefly goes gaga for Che Guevara, writes a obituary, a sort of gushing obituary for Guevara in '67. What's the broader history of opening, not just Rothbard, but attempts for left fusionism with libertarians?
Yeah, and that really does come down to him. If you talk about even people like Mises, who was Rothbard's great teacher, Mises, Hayek, Rand, Friedman, these, and despite Friedman's role in the draft, these are not people who would have ever felt comfortable, like you say, writing something in praise of Guevara. The reason Rothbard was able to do it, and this touches on what I was just talking about, is he would often get down to the idea that you've got to smash the state, right? Maybe the way you're doing it isn't exactly strategically perfect or motivated by libertarianism, and maybe what you want to replace it is terrible in the case of Guevara, but if you are out there actually doing damage to this hideous institution of rapine and destruction and theft that is the state, you're going to cheer that. And he always did. And it made a lot of other libertarians uncomfortable with him for various reasons. Like he was excited, when South Vietnam fell, when the last helicopter was leaving because the state had died. And he was very excited about that. And I'm not, that emotion is not alien to me, but it definitely did create within the movement a sense that he was a bit of a wild man. Though the other way to look at it is not just about state smashing, but that his left turn, and then later in the 90s his turn toward Pat Buchanan and the like, his more right turn, was that he always saw war as the most important issue, and he was looking for whatever actual, because libertarianism was never during his lifetime an actual effective political force, right? Like if you actually wanted to make things happen, to his mind, you had to ally yourself with a political force that actually might be successful or might take power. And he thought the New Left in the Vietnam era was the prominent anti-war force, and he thought libertarianism should support it. In 1992, Pat Buchanan was, post-Cold War, he thought we should support that. So that's where that came from. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Looking at these various attempts to reach out to get together with the right, to reach out to the left, where would you say the most fertile ground is, you're tossing out the seeds, some of them fall on rocky ground, some of them grow up. Historically, where do you think, on which side, has had a more bountiful harvest?
I think if we go back to the issues that you were talking about, and I'm glad you mentioned school vouchers, it was an error on my part not to mention it, deregulation, even the draft, because that was a Nixon project, or Nixon did it. It has to be the right, whatever my non-right tendencies are, my complaints about the right, I think it's a historical fact that in the context of American history in the last 50 years, forces that consider themselves conservative, Republican, right, have been more amenable to the ideas. And I think it is because we meet on free market grounds. Like Milton Friedman, was a lifelong consultant advisor to Republican politicians from Goldwater to Nixon to Reagan, and was seen as a conservative man of the right figure by most. But when he was talking to libertarians, like when I interviewed him in 1995, he made it very clear. It's like, of course, I am a libertarian, but like if you look at my career, you will see, I seem like I'm a guy who's working the Republican Party. Well, I am, because that's where I can be effective. But of course, I'm a libertarian. And he even granted to me that he would like to be a zero government libertarian, like his son David, the anarcho-theorist. But he was a little doubtful that it actually could be a sustainable human social structure. And then I think we went back and forth, and he admitted that strictly limited governments also don't seem to be very long-term sustainable politico-social structure. So, maybe if he had lived a little longer, he would have let a more anarchist flag fly. But, and again, to point out, it was a figure like him found an intellectual home within the right. That's just a fact. And, however we may feel about certain aspects of the right, that's just the way it was.
Yeah, on this whole subject, I'm thinking of another minor opening to the left. My former colleague and your former colleague at one point, Brink Lindsay, going on 20 years ago, the Libertarians bid. And my recollection of, the reaction on the right to Brink's proposal that it's time to say goodbye to any sort of entangling alliance with the right side of the political spectrum. National Review and places like that say, don't go, we like you guys. And Jonathan Chait in the New Republic wrote a response to it, saying that, quoting Michael Corleone in The Godfather, my offer is this, nothing.
This brings up another nice little division within the libertarian world, and I can use my 5 figures, as an example of this. I'd say like Hayek, Mises, and Friedman, all economists, and Leonard Read, who founded the first recognizably modern American libertarian educational institution that's still around today. He called it the Foundation for Economic Education, and that's important. Those figures tended to believe, and Friedman was saying this to me, to within the month he died, I think, that they either believed or thought it was best to act as if they believed, that their interlocutors and opponents and people they're trying to persuade in American political culture largely agreed on goals. Like we want a rich world, we want an abundant world, we want a free world. there's misunderstandings about what's the best, most sustainable way to get there. And so Leonard Read believed that free market economics was the key, that like free market economics teaches us that, okay, you may think you need government to manage things, but if we go back all the way to the root of Adam Smith and the classical economists, all the way to the 20th century Austrians, we begin to understand how rich, complicated international systems of trade develop as if by an invisible hand, as Smith put it, through a spontaneous order, as Hayek put it, and that if you understood free market economics, you would understand you don't need government to have a wealthy, accomplished culture. And in fact, government's attempts to manage things actually tend to thwart people's desires. You know, the great example is price controls, right? People who impose them, what they say they want is for things to be available and abundant. But what price controls actually do is they make them scarce and almost non-existent because people cannot, except through ratcheting and further tyranny, be encouraged to keep producing things at prices either for no profit or profit lower than they want to make. So that's the economic side. Let's just help people understand all this. Rand and Rothbard had, I think, actually a more sophisticated, or at least they added something very important to this, that there are things in the human mind, you know, Rand would call them envy, hatred of the great. Rothbard would just look at like, look, you know, some of these creeps are just, you know, making a living off of the rest of us, and you can't argue them into understanding that they shouldn't want to do that, right? That there are elements in the human psyche that are not amenable to just explaining to them that actually it would be fine if we were all free. There's some people who actually really don't want other people to be free. I think in the modern age, you know, you get figures like Musk become sort of an attraction to this kind of energy. There's some people who just are very, very upset at the notion of people who have vast accumulations of wealth. And they're not, and there are many reasons, even from a libertarian perspective, to poke at the specifics of how certain people got the wealth they had. But, you know, if in fact you can mostly break it down to, well, these people happen to have property ownership, it's usually this. It's usually not that, oh, they're sitting on a giant pile of money. Usually if you're a billionaire in the modern world, it's because you have equity ownership in some sort of enterprise that the entire body of people on planet Earth together have valued very highly, right? And that's fine, but to a lot of people that's not fine, and that's never going to be fine. So it probably is the case that your Leonard Reads and your Mises and your Friedmans were a little more naive than they needed to be about all the victories that needed to be won for libertarian ideas. Economic education is very important. I don't think you're going to get anywhere without it, but I don't think you're going to get it everywhere with just that either.
You remember R. Emmett Terrell, the American Spectator?
I did.
He's maybe still around. He was always writing, you know, a piece called and rewriting a piece called The Conservative Crack-Up. You know, the fault lines within the coalition on the right that were going to blow it up. And we've been talking a lot about, you know, libertarians' overtures to the left and to the right and their fights with it. What are, you know, some of the internal, the fights we picked with ourselves, like the, you know, what are past libertarian crack-ups, and where do the fault lines keep showing up?
I alluded to one of them earlier, the question of how minimal, you know, U.S. foreign interference in the face of a worldwide communist threat should be. There were certainly some who thought of themselves as libertarians who were more supportive of Cold War efforts than say your Rothbards.
Definitely showed up in the Iraq War too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Cato famously stood very firmly against the Iraq War, and it lost them some support from kind of right-leaning institutions that, for the reasons we've been alluding to, sort of saw common cause with libertarians on a lot of things that were very important to them, but couldn't quite see fit to support the notion that the United States does not need to be, you know, exerting military force overseas to manage the world every which way. And I think that when it was no longer international communism, I think that became more clarifying for libertarians. Like intra-libertarian fights about foreign policy, I think, became narrower. But they didn't disappear entirely. Like in the 21st century, Brink Lindsay, who you mentioned, there were certain people within the libertarian world who actually thought that the early 21st century Middle East interventions were justified, not to be pursued. I like to think that the history of the last 20 years has settled that largely. And within the Republican coalition, it has settled it.
Yeah.
Like nowadays in the Trump era, you're considered a loser and an idiot if you ever thought that was a good idea, and that's great. That's again, it's hard to say whether it's it's a victory for libertarian ideas, even if you can't, in intellectual history terms, say, oh, a libertarian thinker caused it to happen, and that's important. I mean, I wrote this book because we're human beings, and human history actually unfolds through humans, and ideas are spread through humans, but it's about the ideas. It's what's important about it is not, how great a novelist Ayn Rand was, or how influential a figure Milton Friedman was, or what a nuanced, complicated, fascinating to contemplate figure either Hayek or Rothbard in their own ways were. I mean, that's great. It allows, people like me to write books that are probably more fun to read because you can connect them to human beings, but like it's the ideas victories that are important, and certainly if you are still a professional advocate of libertarian ideas, it's probably futile to get hung up in like, well, who won this victory? It's like, well, did the idea win? I don't like things about Trump. Well, I don't like things about Trump either, but like if Trump was the instrument for mocking and deriding everyone in the Republican coalition, whoever thought the Iraq war was a great idea, like that's great. And you don't even have to say great for Trump if it grinds your teeth to say great for Trump. You just have to say great for that idea, because that's an important idea.
Well, speaking of Trump and libertarian crack-ups, is it possible we're going through a bit of one now?
Yeah.
In the last, you touched on this a little bit in the last chapter of modern libertarianism, but in the last almost 10 years, ever since he came down the escalator, everything has been about Donald Trump, which is the way he likes it, living rent-free in everyone's head, and rent-free, sad to say, in a lot of the libertarian mind as well. So you talk a little bit about the rise of the Mises Caucus, some of the stuff that happened in the LP. Are we in the middle of another libertarian crack-up that's spurred by the guy who came down the escalator?
Yeah, I think we probably are, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, the distinction I was trying to draw between how ideal Hayekian might look at the whole Doge thing versus how a Rothbardian might look at it. And you're definitely going to see libertarians taking both sides, and you're going to see, as libertarians love to do, getting super mad at the other libertarians, like the ones who are like, how can you not see that this is a nightmare? Okay, sure, some government employees are getting fired, but like, if they're not changing policy, that doesn't mean government is actually shrinking. It just means government is going to be doing the things that makes us all do even worse than it did it before, versus, we've had decades of attempting to ever make the federal workforce shrink. And then, of course, you can get back to the things Clinton did, which, quite honestly, as I speak to, I'm not an expert in, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But, and there's, maybe there were other ways to do it that aren't just like letting Elon Musk do whatever he wants. And, we're seeing those fights happen in real time, and they're probably going to get, uglier. And I think, maybe 2 years from now, we'll actually understand more about, what was the effect of everything that Doge has been doing in the first 2 months. And politics has it's always been very personal, right? I feel like there's not going to be a lot of side changing. Like, even, no matter what we see 2 years from now, I think the people who thought it was a great idea right now are still going to think it was a great idea. And the people who doubted it are probably still going to doubt it. I do want to say this. I intended this book, and I hope for this book to have a shelf life beyond the controversies of, and not even 2025, because obviously I finished writing in 2024. So, you might, don't look for a ton about, certainly nothing about the second Trump administration, because the book was written before the first. And I think probably lots of libertarians who, for what I think were very sensible reasons looking at what Trump 1 did, who never really expected anything government shrinking to come out of Trump. Probably, I've been a little surprised, and I should think anyone would be a little surprised. I did not expect even chaotic and possibly fruitless slashes at the federal bureaucracy to happen instantly, and they have, and it's interesting to watch, and it will be interesting to watch libertarians fight about the hows and whys of it.
It's it's sad to say, but the smart money is probably, it ends up something like the Republican mid-90s chest pounding about getting rid of 4 or 5 cabinet departments. That if you had a lot of skin in the game, that's probably the safer way to bet. But sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say we should bring it back to this. I don't want to. I mentioned this earlier, but I guess I feel like I'll mention it again because I think one of the things about Trump discourse that gets people very head up is like you're not saying the important thing. You're not repeating enough. You're not saying it loud enough. And so I will repeat Trump's attitudes and actions about the international flow of human bodies, human goods, and capital are terrible, ridiculously unlibertarian. Actually, I have an article in what I think is the new issue of Reason, though when you work for a magazine, your sense of what's the last issue and the next issue and the new issue get mixed up. But somewhat recently, there was an article I wrote that's actually derived from this book that talks about Mises particularly, and how Mises used to be a darling of the right, and how I think there's certain things about Trumpism that have gone very wrong by ignoring Mises. But even that, you should understand, was written before he actually took office again the second time, so it doesn't really deal with the Doge stuff. And so that stuff is terrible, and the power grabs, like, I'm definitely enough of a Hayekian to think, yeah, it's not great when one mercurial guy who seems to be really angry and mad at a lot of people and be very driven by revenge against his enemies is attempting to accrue all sorts of power and decision-making strictly in himself. That's alarming and it's terrible. And again, I perhaps bloodlessly, I would prefer judging policies and ideas rather than people. And if all the terrible things about Trump make you feel like, well, I can't even say it's a good idea to cut some government jobs and cut some government programs, I don't think that's fruitful. I don't think it's good for the libertarian cause or any cause, but it's understandable. But similarly, just because you like that doesn't mean you have to go, I'm for Trump, and everything Trump does is great, because Trump is great. It's not about being, it's about whether the policies are correct.
I want to say, I can't speak for the audience, but I, for one, did not suspect you of being Trump curious in any way. But, I think what you were alluding to is sort of calling balls and strikes. The federal effort to root out DEI and get rid of, federally funded identity politics, good. Starting a trade war, the world's stupidest trade war from your couch, bad. I think we can call.
I mean, you can, though. I absolutely completely respect people who are like, no, the dictatorial part actually does overwhelm everything else, and you can never not be against every single thing he does. Like I hear that, and I'm like, I understand why you might feel that way, and it really does. Like, there's a lot about American politics on both sides that in the Trump era that I think really hinges on how completely insane and horrible you assume your political foes are. Like, if you're on the right and you think, okay, if the Democrats get control, all white people's property is going to be confiscated, to give reparations, and there'll be price controls, and private property will be abolished, and we'll all be forced to be transgender or whatever. Like, these are things that I think a lot of people on the right kind of believed, and I'm like, I'm not sure I think that any of that's true, and I wouldn't base my politics on fearing it. And the left has certain fears about Trump, including, I guess, perhaps most significantly, we're never going to have another election again, so it doesn't matter. And if you believe that, and I'm agnostic, it's like as a libertarian, I'm perhaps more open than most to believing the most insane, horrible things about both left and the right, because I have those fears sometimes myself. So I do not completely laugh at every seemingly insane fear that either left or right might have. And then it really just becomes a question of prudence. You can't prove that Trump is not going to cancel the elections right now. You can fear it. You can go, I think that's reasonable. I think it's unreasonable. How you proceed as a citizen right now is, I think, more of a question of prudence than a question of, I know the future, or I know what the right thing, and if you don't know the future, then you don't know what the right thing to do is, because what the right thing to do depends on what you think the future is going to be, and it all gets very complex. I'm temperamentally not inclined to be completely fearful. I've always been pretty optimistic. I think being a libertarian, along with libertarianism in a lot of cases, and in my case, is a sort of techno-optimism. Like we're excited about human possibilities, and we're excited about the possibility of human freedom, and we feel like we've seen just our command of nature and power in the electric sense, not in the governmental sense. We've seen so much positive change and progress, and we believe that more freedom is going to lead to more of it. And my general sense of the human future, there's a strong strain of almost hysterical techno-optimism in the libertarian world. If you've ever heard the term extropy, and these people are like, oh, we're all gonna be minds, and whatever the craziest technological possibility you can imagine in terms of increasing human capability. Libertarians have tended to be the ones who believed it, and I do believe in it. So I'm not temperamentally inclined to be completely fearful, but I also don't think it's at all crazy to look at Trump's behavior in the last month and have some not unreasonable fears that he wants to change the way American governance runs in ways that are probably not going to redound to libertarian benefit, even if a bunch of bureaucrats get fired. But anyway, I don't know.
I mean, but another libertarian feature would be, I'd like to hope, is being sort of dispassionate, rational, and transactional about, whoever's in power, not getting caught up in the cult or the anti-cult of that particular figure. And, I sort of feel since the rise of Trump, that's eroding. You get the impression that, we can put on one side, there's one significant faction of the libertarian movement that went full barking MAGA, which is a big mistake. There's another faction that, you get the sense there's an effort to sort of reduce, radical anti-statist philosophy to like a bunch of platitudes on one of those "in this house" yard signs that, you see in nice neighborhoods with a lot of NGO workers. And you get the impression that in the vanishingly unlikely scenario in which Trump were to turn out to be not Orange Hitler, but Orange Millet, there's a whole bunch of people that are going to be libertarians who are going to be really disappointed and frustrated by that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure that I have anything more to add on the Trump. Well, actually, there is one more thing, and again, one does feel. It's one of the things I don't really like about the internet age, actually, and there's a lot of great things about it, but that sort of felt pressure and understanding of how, like, okay, a thing is said, and you know what everyone is going to say against it, and then you know what everyone's going to say against that. Like, you can write if you're an intelligent, aware person, you can write the comment thread in your head, and it all just becomes boring in a sense, and like, I don't even want to say anything because it just feels all very played out. It's like, this might also just be an old man's complaint, but I think it's an old man in the internet age's complaint.
Old man yells at cloud.
Is that everything, A, B, C, yes, D. So I'm feeling the imaginary comment thread pressure to bring up this point about Trump, which I think is worth bringing up, though it definitely ties into what you were saying about, are you just being hysterical about this? Is the guy, and more the people surrounding him than the guy, definitely seem to have a concern with ethno-statism that is extremely disconcerting, and it's a bad little scent around things, and I think it makes people nervous beyond any policy specific. It's like, you're really concerned with like German parties who want to keep immigrants out, and you're really concerned with keeping immigrants out here, and you definitely do seem to like to make fun of people who aren't, white men or whatever. Like, that's not a comforting space for a libertarian to inhabit, and it does go beyond policy issues. And maybe in the future it'll make, you look like an innie because you're worried about that. But it's hard not to think about it.
I don't want them to rip up my techno-optimist card, but when you were talking a minute ago. I was thinking of, and it's maybe because I was younger, but really the era of Google Reader and blogs was a much better sort of discourse, and because you couldn't just, point and say, look at this idiot. Look at what this idiot wrote.
Yeah.
You have to write like a 500-word blog post about it,
About what an idiot he was.
engage with it, and now it's
this
just
is
grunting.
absolutely an old man's gripe, but like I write books about stuff, and like I wrote a short one now, but decades ago I wrote a long one. Like I think books are the best way to engage with and understand ideas, and obviously that's not the way the younger generation works. And I'm gonna shrug. I'm gonna shrug like an old man about that. But.
All right, we'll get off Trump because he takes up too much of everyone's attention in general. And right before we go to questions, I've got one last one. As I said, you're the historian of the libertarian movement, and a devotee of the grand cause yourself. So the question is to ask you to do a little movement self-criticism, some of which you've done along the way. Where do libertarians go wrong? This is kind of like that horrible interview question. It's like, what's your biggest weakness? Except I don't want you to say, right. Our biggest weakness is we care about liberty too much. But what is the biggest weakness of the libertarian?
I honestly don't have a good answer to that. I really don't. I am enough of a believer in these ideas, and I have found the people I learned them from the figures in this book to, think tankers of the 21st century, to be doing a good enough job that, like your instinct, of course, is to blame other people because they're too stupid to get it or whatever, and which sounds horrible. I don't completely disbelieve that, and some of the ideas that I was alluding to earlier that Rand and Rothbard brought up, some people don't actually love the idea of everyone flourishing in freedom. There's senses of control and senses of envy and senses of, some people have too much and they shouldn't have that no matter how they had it. I'm gonna have to punt that. I could scramble and start talking a lot and maybe say something intelligent, but I don't know. I don't know do you feel you have an answer to that question?
No, was I supposed to?
I'm just wondering.
Anytime you read about anything that Rothbard, Williamson Evers, other figures have written about children, that's always been a stumbling block for liberty.
Yeah.
We don't know how to deal with these little humans that aren't rational beings yet.
Yeah. No,
so some of it comes off as quite demented, but I don't know that that's the biggest flaw.
Yeah, okay, you've got me in a direction, and not just the children's thing. I'm not going to get into too much, but in general, the ruthless, rationalistic application of property rights theory, which even though I believe in it, I am well aware because I talk to more normal human beings than not, like my non-libertarians. My social life is large, like 99%. Either dedicated or just sort of background progressives, Democrats in the modern American sense. And I'm aware that demented is a very good word to put it. They think the application, the one where I've gotten the most backlash is this Rothbardian thing, which maybe not all libertarians believe, about blackmail. I'm going to get back to the beginning. I talked about how, this libertarian project is about figuring out how to minimize the use of violence in human affairs. And so Rothbard came up to what I think some pretty interesting conclusions about what should be considered crimes. And one of his more controversial ones is that blackmail, not a crime. You cannot prevent or punish someone for coming to you and saying, I am going to say something about you, true or untrue, and unless you pay me not to. And like nearly every normal human being is like, that's appalling behavior. We cannot let that happen. That must be legally punishable. Rothbard, by the rigorous application of his sense of property rights, is like, well, no, because that person, all they're doing is they might say something, And we have the right to say things, right? We even have the right to tell lies. We certainly have the right to tell the truth. They are offering you a chance to do a fairly, a deal that both of you agree upon to stop you from saying it. And people are like, well, it destroys your reputation, right? Isn't that? And he's like, well, yeah, but what's your reputation? Your reputation is the thoughts and attitudes in other people's heads about you, and you do not control them. And we're getting some laughter even in the room. Now, I think I'm pretty fairly describing the Rothbardian argument about blackmail. I don't think I'm getting it wrong in a substantial degree. And even in this room, we have gentlemen who, and I don't know if you're laughing about it because you think it's absurd, or of course you also agree with it, but you're aware that other people think it's absurd. So, yeah, there is, libertarianism has a proprietarian streak to it and a rationalistic streak to it that does indeed strike many people as demented. But I can't sit here and really say that that's a problem to be overcome, mostly because I actually believe that stuff too, right? And maybe many people in this room do. So then the question is, well, can you figure out a better way to sell this? And yeah, it actually gets back to what's happening in the world today, which, again, this book is definitely not really about what's happening in the world today, but we're talking in the world today, so let's talk about the world today. When Goldwater was the success Goldwater was, it was kind of an argument within the libertarian community, 64, about whether it actually might be a bad thing for libertarian ideas that they were being pushed forward in electoral politics way before the American people were ready for them. The whole Leonard Read idea was we needed, and that was really the kind of whole movement project, at least through the 80s, was all about education. That's all it was about. We've got to create a population that understands and believes these ideas, and that if the vagaries of fate and Trump's personality and Musk's personality put us in a world where there's libertarian-y things happening that everyone is appalled by, that might not, if you're thinking in the long term, and I think all libertarians, if you don't want to go insane, you do have to think in the long term because you don't get very many short-term victories. It is worth wondering, in 15 years, is even these very libertarian-y things that are happening right now, are they going to prove in the long term good for the libertarian cause, or is government action so far ahead of, and we live in a world with other people, and we live in a world with a certain set of government, and you do need to grapple with the ideas, and you need to cope with the ideas that other people have. You can't just, libertarians are often accused in the Nancy McLean age of you actually want a dictatorship because you're aware that you can only impose your crazy freedom ideas through a dictatorship, and that's certainly not true, and it's kind of ironically paradoxical to say that, you're a dictator, but you're just not imposing government force on people. But I don't think it's completely out of line for libertarians who do have a world historical view to wonder if it's dangerous if government actions are more libertarian than a democratic populace wants them to be.
All right. We've about 5 minutes for questions. We're going to try to take some from in the room and some from online. Make them as short as possible. Have them end in a question. Use your name, your affiliation if you think it matters, and wait for the mic.
Thank you very much. I'm Leon Weintraub. I'm wondering if you can give us some ideas about some application of libertarian principles. Let me give you a couple of examples. Number one is school vouchers, which was mentioned before, versus the objective of having all citizens with a certain amount of education, comprehensive, to be informed citizenry. And a second example is how to have a successful economy that attracts investment without certain institutions such as, for example, the SEC, the FDIC, and heaven forbid, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Yeah, super quick answer to that. A part of the libertarian project is, or kind of an ideal here is it's very difficult. Libertarianism starts to seem like political science fiction people, right? Because we've lived in a world where all these institutions exist. And there's just a huge body of work, again, mostly from the economists, that actually attempt to explain, okay, here's how the things that we all want to have happen can happen without a government-funded monopoly organization. Most of the things you're talking about, people would say, well, like, you know, the Underwriters Laboratory is the classic example, that institutions that people need are going to arise, and if people need them and want them, they're going to be willing to pay for them. And that may tie in with what we're talking about certain libertarian ideas just sound demented to people, but that's why the libertarian educational process and the people who fought it is ongoing, because you have to be able to show people analytically you don't need a government monopoly on any service that people actually want. And libertarians believe that, and it's certainly not going to sound convincing in a 2-minute answer to a question or even like an hour-long lecture, but that's the general idea.
Online audience, in the 3 minutes remaining, you may join the conversation and submit questions directly on the event webpage, Facebook, YouTube, and X using hashtag Cato Events. Pericles, do you have a good question from
We do, from the online world. Thanks, Gene. Yeah, the book focused on political and economic thinkers. What role do you think science fiction writers like Heinlein had in promoting libertarian ideas? Many people credit science fiction as their on-ramp to the ideas of individualism and freedom, and we talked about techno-optimism, techno-pessimism. What do you think?
Yeah, to the extent which I've always believed that like the more people there are in the world that believe this stuff, the better. Figures like Heinlein have been enormously important, possibly more important than some of the philosophers. He was very important to me when I was a kid, and and you know, Rand was big on this. It's the dramatization of human achievement in a realm of liberty, which Heinlein was great at, is extremely eye and mind opening. And you know, if I could make every person under 13 read a Heinlein book, which I would not do because I'm a libertarian, I think it would be great if they did.
one final one.
Yeah, so just, quickly, I'd love to hear your comments on what's happening now in Argentina with Javier Milei and his attempt to implement some of these ideas.
Yeah, I'm monolingual, and I have not been. I wrote a little bit about Milei, so I'm speaking in a headline-y way, which I usually don't really like doing. But you asked, and I will answer. To the extent that I understand what's going on, it seems mostly good, and its actual effects, to the extent I've seen them in the macroeconomic stats, have been, it shouldn't be surprising to a libertarian, but it's been heartening how not bad for the country even this sort of shock therapy approach has been. And I preface all that I may learn things about Milei, and I may know things if I read Spanish or Portuguese or all the languages of that land that I don't understand now. But like to what I know, thumbs up to Milei, I guess.
I think that's a good upbeat note to close on. I'd like to thank you all for being here, for what was it, rollicking conversation about modern libertarianism. I encourage you to pick up the book. They're for sale outside. Brian will probably sign some of them for you if you do. Thank you all for being here, and please join us for a reception in Cato's Winter Garden.